Welcome to Workplace Wake Up, your go-to podcast for practical employment law guidance. I'm Jennifer Shaw, the founder of Shaw Law Group, and I'm here to help HR professionals and leaders navigate the legal minefields of the modern workplace. Each week, we tackle real-world issues with clear advice and a little tough love. Let's get started. We are going to talk about documentation. Now, I find documentation super interesting because honestly, it can help you or hang you, right? If you do it right, documentation can be your absolute best friend when you have a complaint or you have an administrative hearing or anything of the sort. What you've documented contemporaneously is considered very credible. So when you have good documentation, you are a leg up on any claim that is filed against your organization. On the other hand, when you have documentation that is not well written, it is worse than having no documentation. So I love this story. Years ago, when I was a brand new lawyer, I was working with this employer that ran a 24-hour convenience store, a chain of them. And he was being sued. They were being sued for age discrimination by a woman who was 72 years old at the time. She applied for a job to work in one of their stores in a pretty dangerous area, and it was an overnight shift. So the woman applies for the job and they say, gosh, you sure you know where you are here? Like, this is a dangerous area. You sure you want to do this? She said, yep, I'm ready to roll. I love the nighttime. I've done jujitsu. I know what I'm doing. I'm ready to roll. So the manager says, okay, well, thank you very much. We're interviewing a lot of people, which was not true. They did not have one other applicant for that job. But the manager said, I'm interviewing a lot of people and I will get back to you. Thank you so much for your interest. Really appreciate it. The next thing he writes on the top of the application is in all black Sharpie ink, too old, and he files it away. Okay, a week later, he calls the woman, says, we hired somebody else. He finally found another applicant, of course, didn't tell her that, and she sues. She says, I think it's because of my age. You don't think I can hold my own. Now, it's reasonable for somebody who owns an all-night convenience store to want someone who looks kind of intimidating to be in that job, right? Somebody who maybe is bigger, has a larger physical presence, not based on race or national origin or anything like that, or even sex, but somebody who looks a little more formidable, right, to someone who wants to come knock the place over. Not what they did here, though, right? They focused exclusively on the age. And that is a problem, because when they wrote too old on that application and I got a discovery request and I asked them to send me all the documentation they had on that recruitment for that role, and what did this candidate give them and what did they say to this candidate, up pops the application with that big bold Sharpie ink. All right, that documentation is a problem. So what I want you to think about is, first of all, what we call the golden rules of effective workplace documentation, okay? And what that is really is who, what, when, where, and why. And you got to have a date on the document, and it's got to be identified who wrote it. Now, sometimes this is very easy because you're working on an internal system and it's clear who wrote it because somebody has to put in their initials, right? But if you're just writing down something on a piece of paper and putting it in a logbook at the restaurant, right? And you didn't put your initials, you didn't put your name, nobody knows what you're talking about, that's a problem. Okay, so let's talk about the golden rules of documentation. Rule number one, you got to include detail. Who, what, when, where, how, why. Who wrote the documentation? What date did they write it? What did both parties say, right? So you've got to have the detail. It doesn't do any good to say, I met with Jen on July 21st. I told her she has a bad attitude. I told her she doesn't come to work on time. I told her if she doesn't improve, she's going to be fired. Love the manager. Well, what did Jennifer say? That's important. If you're documenting the situation, you've got to document the entire situation. So you need details, okay? Second golden rule of documentation is you've got to save it. You've got to make sure it doesn't get lost. You've got to make sure it doesn't get in the wrong hands, right? So you've got to make sure you save it where it should be saved and that it's kept in a place where somebody can find it, even if you leave the organization. You may not be there, but we still may need your documentation, okay? The third rule of effective documentation is that you don't mess with it after you write it. Because the value of contemporaneous documentation is that you wrote it contemporaneously. And if you start fussing around with it a couple weeks later because you think of something you wish you had added, that's going to throw the whole integrity of that document off. So once you write it, you're done. Now, you might write a follow-up and say, hey, I wrote this documentation and I realized X or I realized Y. That's fine. But you have to understand that the value of that documentation is that you wrote it before there was a lawsuit, before there was a claim, before you talked to your lawyer who told you how to do it. Okay, and sometimes the lawyer will tell you how to do it during an advice phase of the process, right? We don't have active litigation. We're just trying to prevent a problem from happening. But whatever it is, you've got to make sure that it's contemporaneous with what is going on in the organization. You don't go back and document something that happened 3 months ago because now the employee did something they shouldn't have and you want to really pile it on. So you go back and you figure out what they did 3 months ago and you start writing them up for that. It just looks shady because it is shady, right? It doesn't look transparent. It looks like you have a motive. You have an agenda. You have something you're trying to make happen there, okay? So don't do that. All right. I want you also to think about words and phrases that can come back to haunt you. Okay, I talked about this a little bit in performance reviews, right? Please do not include phrases about people's leave of absence or whether or not they decided to have children or whether they made a complaint. Okay, that's not relevant. You are documenting what happened in a particular situation. Now, obviously, if the complaint or the fact that they had a baby or whatever is relevant, fine, include that. But you want to avoid these phrases like, oh, before you engaged in protected activity, right? Insert that here. You were such a nice employee and now you're not, right? Now I'm mad at you. Another word and phrase I want you to keep out of this is this idea of you're not a good fit. Right? It doesn't seem like Jen's a good fit. Well, here's the problem with that. It's so personal that you must mean it's my sex or my race or my national origin or the color of my skin or what I told you my religious belief was. When you say they're not a good fit, it's basically an invitation for the other person to say, oh yeah, I know I'm not a good fit because I don't go to the same church as you go to and I don't look like you. So never do this, you're not a good fit. Make sure it is factual. Your documentation has to be factually focused and not feelings focused. So in other words, you're never going to say Jennifer's a bad manager. Jennifer might be a bad manager, but what is she doing? Oh, Jennifer doesn't communicate expectations clearly. Jennifer fails to follow up when she sets deadlines. Jennifer's a bad team player. What? What does that mean? Oh, well, Jennifer failed to collaborate with Chris on this project, which created an issue and meant that the project was 3 days late. Okay, now we can talk about that. It's true that I'm not a team player, but that's a label. The label doesn't get us anywhere. We need the facts. We need to understand what exactly is going on there. So I want you documenting what actually happened. Now, the other thing is, if behavior is relevant, document the behavior. So if somebody produced all 100 widgets that they needed to produce, but they did it with a really cruddy attitude, you're going to document the attitude. You're not just going to document that they completed the 100 widgets, unless, they're doing it at home and we don't care what their attitude is, right? They don't interact with anybody. Maybe that would be different. But I want you to understand that when you're looking at documentation, especially if you ever end up before a jury, which is going to be very rare, right? Most of these employment cases never get close to a jury. But you may end up in a mediation. You may end up in an arbitration with as much arbitration as many employers are doing these days because it gives them some protection from PAGA cases and from other claims. You may also end up responding to a demand letter where you need documentation and you want to say to a lawyer, there's these lawyer mills where they send these form letters, and we get them all the time on behalf of our clients. And we have to write back and say, yeah, pound sand. You don't know what you're talking about, and here's why. But it's always really helpful to be able to include a memo to the employee that said, if you're going to do this again, you're going to be fired. So think about that before you do, right? So the documentation can really be a lifesaver when you're looking at lawsuits, demand letters, claims, administrative agency proceedings, that sort of thing. Now, what I don't want you to do with documentation is have the employees sign it, okay? Now, you might have the employees sign the performance improvement plan, of course, that you prepare, or the expectations memo that you prepare, or the performance review that you prepare. But the documentation, the guts, like how the sausage is made, they don't need to sign that. And as soon as you give it to them, they're going to say, oh, well, I didn't say it that way. Well, that's not really what happened. Well, I don't think you wrote down exactly what I said. There were a few things you didn't write down here. You do not want to get into that realm, okay? You act in good faith, you document fully and completely, and somebody may say that they don't like the way you did it, and that's fine. If you get into a discussion or a debate about whether or not the documentation is appropriate, you're going to take way too much time and the focus is on the wrong thing. We're only documenting because we want to change the employee's performance or because we want to recognize that they've done a good thing. And maybe we're documenting it in a way that they don't think is positive enough, but that's not for them to say, right? Don't give it to them to review. I feel this way also about conducting investigation interviews. I know a lot of folks will write a statement and then they want the witness to sign the statement. Okay, because they think it gives them some kind of protection, but it doesn't. You realize that they can sign it today and then next week they can say they only signed it because you threatened them or they felt coerced or they were so uncomfortable with the questioning that you were engaged in that they just wanted to get the HE double toothpick out of there. And so they were willing to sign just about anything. So it doesn't really give you the protection that people think it gives you. All right. So my view on this is you don't need them to sign it. The underlying documentation, you don't need them to sign, but the result, they got a performance review, they got a raise, they got a write-up, they got a PIP, whatever. That's great. That they should sign and acknowledge, but not your own chicken scratch individual documentation. And by the way, it can't be chicken scratch because we have to be able to read it. That's why we need it to have a name on it and a date, and we need to know who prepared it. You've also got to keep it in a place where we can find it. We talked about that earlier, right? I want to make sure that you really think about that how do you create a system in your organization where people can find that documentation? Now, here's another trap for employers. They're going to terminate somebody. Maybe they're doing a reduction in force. Maybe it's performance-based, okay? They're going to terminate somebody. And they say, all right, I'm going to go into this interview with this employee, this meeting, right, this termination meeting, and I'm going to bring my notes. I'm going to bring all of my documentation, and I'm going to show it to the employee. Why? You don't need to do that. Don't give them a roadmap of what worked and what didn't. Tell them what your decision is. Hey, Tom, we've had a number of meetings about your failure to meet deadlines. You missed another deadline yesterday, and it is unacceptable. The client is very upset. We cannot keep doing this. I'm very sorry, but the time has come for us to part ways. And Tom says, well, do you have any documentation? I'd really like to see it. Well, Tom, it's undisputed that you missed the deadline. You and I talked about that. I called you right away. You gave me your excuse about why you missed it, but you missed it, and we're done. Right now, you might be a little nicer. I would be a little nicer too, but you see where I'm going, right? You don't give them your whole file. You don't open up all the documentation and say, hey, here's my documentation. Why don't you go through it and see if you disagree with any of it? Don't do it, okay? Especially if you have at-will employees, but even if you don't have at-will employees, even if you're a public entity and your employees have passed probation, this particular employee has passed probation and they're a for-cause employee. I don't care. Don't give them all the recipes, okay? Don't show them how the sausage is made. All right. Again, folks, documentation can help you or hang you. Take the time to do it right. It doesn't have to be perfect. I don't want you to go back and proof it 3 weeks later and fuss it up a little bit. Write it, put it in the file, whether it's an actual file or an electronic file, and move on. All right? Thank you so much for joining me today, everyone. I hope you enjoy what is left of this beautiful summer. Just a couple more days, and we'll be at Labor Day. All right. Thanks, everyone. Take care. Workplace Wake Up, including our guests and hosts, do not provide legal advice in this podcast. Do not act upon any of the information discussed in this podcast without first consulting a licensed attorney in your jurisdiction. Thank you for joining me on this episode of Workplace Wake Up. If you found today's discussion helpful, be sure to subscribe, leave a review, and share the podcast with your HR and leadership teams. For more insights, training programs, and legal updates, you can visit us at shawlawgroup.com.